Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this session at the Social Work International Conference. I'm delighted today to be joined by Liz Beddoe from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. This is a pre-recorded session just because of different parts of the world and different times that people will be around. But Liz obviously would have been in the panel that we've got on Saturday on abortion rights, except it's 4 o'clock in the morning New Zealand time, so a bit early for expecting somebody to be on a panel. Liz is a professor of social work in New Zealand, long-term experience around women and health and social work, but she's also a founder member of the Reimagining Social Work Collective and Rebel Social Work down in New Zealand. Liz, it's a real honour to have you with us. You're going to talk to us today about reproductive rights and social work attitudes towards that and abortion or whatever. So maybe if you could just start off by talking about why you think this is an important issue, why reproductive health and reproductive rights are an important issue for social workers around the world.
I think primarily for me it comes down to the fact that all women face issues in terms of their reproductive health. They have to access reproductive health care. It's a really important part of health care. And it's, particularly when we're thinking about abortion, it's an aspect of healthcare that is incredibly contested virtually everywhere, unlike pretty well every other aspect of healthcare. So for me, it's a social work issue because it's a matter of social justice. Healthcare, reproductive healthcare in particular are basic rights and trampled on so often around the world in a way that, it doesn't happen for other parts of our health, and so for me it's a social work issue. I guess it also comes from my own practice as a social worker in health settings for a long time, and a particularly long stint in women's health, where part of my role was in fact being part of reproductive healthcare and abortion care in particular, at a time that abortion was still heavily contested. There were protesters outside the gate of our service every day. I dealt with a bomb threat, an arson attack on the clinic, and regular harassment, and had to trespass protesters. So for me, it was a very strong emotional experience, as well as a politically charged experience as a practitioner. And I've never quite forgotten how important those issues are, even though we've had changes in our abortion legislation in New Zealand.
So just to pick up on one of those themes, we see those pictures from different parts of the globe of protesters outside abortion clinics. It clearly must take its toll on those who are working and, of course, on those women who are accessing services. How do social workers in the field cope with those kind of pressures and support requirements?
Yeah, I think when you're actually working in the service, to some extent your focus is on the people that you're providing a service to, the pregnant person, their loved ones, their supporters who bring them to a service for care. So you tend to get a little bit focused on their well-being and making sure that people can get into the service as safely as possible. But yes, it does take a toll. I think probably I noticed more after I left, and I reflected on when I went into a different job, how amazing it was to go to work every morning and not to face harassment on the way into the office. I went into a social work education setting where there's a queue of students wanting extensions for their essays, but there was nothing in comparison to the sort of harassment that we faced, and being able to be in a building and not be afraid about people coming in or threatening us or threatening the people that we're working with, it does take a bit of a toll. And I guess often it was one of the things that was incredibly aggravating from a professional point of view was that when people face that threat coming in, or they have to be literally smuggled in to services, lying down under a blanket on the back seat of the car, and shuffled in through the back entrance to the service, they're dealing with that. So there's a lot of emotional space taken up in dealing with that. And then, you know, they're having to deal with a very personal decision, which sometimes is very straightforward and other times is extremely complex and difficult. And to face that, you know, on top of dealing with your own situation is quite a load. So often we would spend quite a bit of time talking with our clients about their experience of getting to this point that they're actually in the building and able to get some informed information about the service they're going to have and be able to make their decision with the best information.
So over the last couple of years, I mean, I suppose I think about my own, you know, demonstrating and campaigning work. It's certainly from the UK perspective. There was the movements of the 60s and then through the 70s, and in Britain, the last real attempt to push back were probably in the early 1980s, and globally there was then a period of relative calm. But over the last couple of years, we've seen some really dramatic protest movements and social movements going around reproductive rights. In places like Ireland, that's been about pushing against the state for reproductive rights, but there's other places where there's clearly pushback from perhaps the populist right and from populist forces against women's rights. How would you assess where we are in those movements for reproductive rights?
I think it's really there's a kind of real continuum at the moment from countries where there's been, you know, a shift towards reform. I mean, Ireland's a really good example of that. And to some extent, I was, in the work I've done over the last couple of years, was really inspired by the Irish social work campaign. And you know, and also in Australia, there have been a number of states of Australia where there has been considerable reform. So there's that happening, and in Argentina. But then on the other hand, we've got what's happened in Poland, and I know that you have a speaker on what's happening in Poland. But I mean, the American example is so obvious, where where the attack on reproductive rights in general has been so extreme. I mean, and sustained. So despite Roe versus Wade, which is set into the legal framework, the right for abortion, states everywhere across the US have tried to push back with the most bizarre draconian legislation that, you know, is so invasive of women's lives and bodies, to the extent that it's hard to countenance in a country that considers itself to be democratic and civilized. And where you've also had extreme campaigns that have actually involved, you know, so-called pro-lifers killing people who are carrying out their profession and providing abortion services. Bomb threats constantly, physical assaults, incredibly abusive harassment of people seeking care. So I think it's a real continuum. But I think when you see those things happening as a woman and as an advocate in this area, you kind of feel you can never quite rest on your laurels that we might have achieved you know, some reform, but in fact there's always that threat of pushback, because the pro-life movement is so well organised and so wealthy, and we know that money goes into other countries from the American pro-life movement to support campaigns.
So there's the pro-life or the anti-abortion campaigns financed by, you know, those organisations in America and elsewhere, and obviously that's one area in which you get pushback taking place. But another argument that sometimes comes forward is that if they can't get the full way with changes to legislative agenda, then at least what there should be is conscientious clauses that those that don't agree with abortion should have the right to avoid taking part in procedures or in reproductive health support. What's your response to those kind of arguments?
I think for me, the crucial argument is that, I mean, no health professional can literally be forced to do anything that they don't think is right. You know, they have to make an ethical decision for themselves. However, we do have a responsibility to provide people with information about services that they're legally entitled to access. So at the moment, we have a group of health professionals who oppose abortion, who have literally attempting to sue the Crown, in the case of New Zealand, for their right not to refer on to other services. Now that is actually happening in the court at the moment, it's interesting that, you know, there are many arguments that are pushing back against that, but we don't know which way that's going to go. But you know, when all we're asking for is for health professionals who don't support a pregnant person's right to seek an abortion or seek information even about having an abortion, or contraception in the case of some extreme views, like opposing you know, so-called morning after contraception, opposing all methods of contraception, that those people should advise that they're not prepared to provide that, especially if they're specialists in, say, gynecology or obstetrics, or even in general practitioners. Should not, you know, they should advise patients. It should be very clear to patients that they don't provide that service, and if they do see someone, they should have a moral and ethical responsibility to refer that person on, not to act as a barrier to slow down, to delay, or to prevent the woman or pregnant person from actually getting a service. Because we know that if that I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to refer you, I don't do that, it carries a load of stigmatizing moral judgment with it.
Yeah. So I suppose one of the inspiring things then of the last couple of years is, in the face of the attempt to push back at the policy level, or at the attempt by some medical organisations or whatever to build these clauses in, we've seen the rise of some really significant protest movements and women's movements. Again, just to give us some overview about what's your take on where the movements for abortion rights and freedom of choice are at the present time.
That we've been lucky in many countries that despite long-term opposition, there've been really strong groups that have continued to fight, continued to counter the disinformation that's about. And at the moment you have any legislation under consideration, there will be an onslaught of disinformation, and this, you know, sits with the whole kind of, I guess, post 2016 you know, flow of misinformation that we've had on virtually everything you can possibly think of, and so there's a need to counter that. And I know some people have, you know, our previous legislation was passed in 1977, and we passed reformed legislation at the beginning of last year. So it took an awful long time to get there, and over that time some people just persisted, and to be honest, I mean, I kind of just dropped out of the issue for a long time. There were many other things, battles to fight, but I was so inspired by the campaign in Ireland, and knowing that our own law reform was, you know, on the agenda, and inspired by the sort of determination of people here, decided to try and raise it again as a social work issue. And I've written with some colleagues about how individual social workers, small groups of social workers certainly do band together, and the Irish campaign is a good example of that, to raise the profile of the issue amongst social workers. But it's our professional associations have often been very quiet, and that was what motivated me and my Australian colleague and another colleague here in New Zealand to write about that relative, what I call the relative silence. And I think there's a whole lot of reasons for that. I think it's a controversial issue. I think professional associations are worried about upsetting their membership, about they take a strong stand on reproductive justice issues, that they will lose members. And it may be that at particular times the governance of professional bodies may be more conservative. So I think it is something that seems to happen outside of the, I guess, the sort of strong professional response at that level of national or state, you know, professional bodies. So I think for me, that's one of the reasons why I've kind of wanted to really push it along and keep raising the issue.
So yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, I think the way in which that it's really been a silenced issue in the history of social work and professional social work organisations. I wonder just if, to bring us to an end then, hopefully that there will be lots of young social workers from around the world watching over this weekend. And if you could just sum up to them about why you think this is a key issue for social work and why radical social work in particular must take up the cudgels and clearly nail its colours to the mast in terms of defence of abortion rights and reproductive health.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, it comes down to the essential core of what social work is. It's a social justice-based profession. It's a human rights-based profession. We all pretty well everywhere have, statements about who we are, definitions of social work that emphasise social justice and human rights. And we can't sort of be in favour of denying rights for women. Women hold up half the sky, and it's it is a massive issue of rights care. And saying women hold up half the sky, I'm obviously making a reference to an old quote, but and obviously it affects all pregnant people. It's to me it's. We can't say that we are struggling to empower people if we are allowing massive threats to their integrity, to their own right to make decisions about their bodies and their future. We can't do that and say that we're being true to those aspects of our profession that we hold really dear. And there are real consequences of denied abortion. As a social worker, I saw many people who presented really late for abortions, which became much more stressful and difficult. And because of delays, because they were pushed back by health professionals who didn't want to tell them the truth, didn't want to tell them their legal rights, because they were delayed in getting service, and because sometimes family harassment as well. I mean, years ago, I had neighbours who were so frightened of the males in their family that they hid their contraceptive pills in a safe place in my garden with my consent, because they were really concerned about violence that would occur if they were found to be using contraception. So, this is the real social work issue. It's about our bodily integrity, our safety, and our right to determine our own futures. And I'm absolutely delighted to see this featuring in a conference. I mean, I've been to a few conferences over a few years, and I have been the only person presenting on abortion rights, and felt pretty lonely and pretty worried about who was going to turn up to the sessions. But there was always a lovely army of people who would come and sit there, and I always felt sort of vaguely protected by these people I didn't know, who were clearly giving me lots of body language to say they were supportive. But it shouldn't be like that. It should be until every person has the right to exercise their rights over their body and their future. Then we should keep going on this. Liz, and I'll be delighted to see young colleagues joining us.
So Liz, thanks very much for your time today. It's been really interesting talking to you, and thanks very much for your work. Your article on these struggles in critical radical social work is proven very popular. Lots of downloads. So it's been really good to hear from you today, and thanks very much for contributing to the Swan Eye Conference.
Thanks for the opportunity.